Hello, everybody. My name is Ryan Averett. I'm a licensed clinical social worker and a mental health therapist. And today, I wanted to spend some time talking about Sigmund Freud and his contributions to the field of mental health treatment. I think when we hear the name Freud, what comes to mind is a caricature of a cocaine addict who has bizarre ideas about sex. And while all of that is true, I think we tend to throw the baby out with the bathwater when it comes to Freud. Freud had lots of ideas, and some of them were very bizarre and unhelpful, and some of them were very profound and impactful to the field. And, in modern day, we tend to ignore a lot of the positive impacts that he had and just focus on his bizarre, kooky ideas that he had. So today I wanted to flip that and focus on the more positive aspects of Freud's ideas. So today, we are steel-manning Sigmund Freud, the father of therapy. As a disclaimer, I am not endorsing all of Freud's ideas and his statements. Freud was wrong about a lot of things. Also, I'm a mental health therapist, but I do not do Freudian psychoanalysis as a treatment because much better treatments exist today. There are some people out there that do Freudian psychoanalysis, but they're very few and far between. That probably has something to do with the fact that insurance companies won't let people bill for Freudian psychoanalysis, again, because it's dated and there's much better treatments that exist today. But all that to say, I don't do and I've never done Freudian psychoanalysis, and I don't endorse all of his ideas. Now, if we're going to steelman Freud, we'll start by talking about the state of psychology before Freud. We'll dig into some of his core ideas that are worth discussion, and then we'll conclude by talking about why we dismiss Freud today. Starting out, what was the state of psychology before Freud? At the time, mental illness was largely treated in asylums, and the focus was custodial, not therapeutic. It was about, let's get these people away from all the normal people, and less about, okay, let's see if we can cure or help or do anything to modify these negative parts of, people having mental illnesses. Psychiatry at the time was mostly medical interventions, and that looked like rest cures. Let's get you some rest. Maybe some of these problems will go away when you get a significant amount of sleep. Electrotherapy, confinement, right? Again, let's get you away from all the normal people in society, and maybe some confinement will do you some good. A side note about electrotherapy, this is still done today. ECT treatment exists, and it doesn't look like what you might think it looks like from movies. It's not a first line of treatment, it's not a second line of treatment, but for some people who've gone through multiple mental health treatments before and nothing's been helpful, ECT is an option. And it can be helpful. Like, I've met with a couple individuals who've done ECT before, and at least some of those people have praised it and said, this helped when nothing else did. So ECT is still done today. Many people don't know that, and if you're interested in it, you can just Google ECT treatment. Alright, going back, before Freud, patients were often viewed as defective or morally weak, not people who had inner conflicts going on. And Freud's radical move was to treat mental suffering through conversation and exploration of inner life. There wasn't really anyone who did this at the time, and maybe we know this as a fact, but I think we forget this a lot. Like, no one was doing psychotherapy before Freud. He introduced it. And that's significant. Like, we may not have the field of therapy today if Freud never existed and popularized some of his ideas and started therapy. So I think we have to recognize that. What are some of Freud's ideas worth discussion? We'll start out by talking about the unconscious mind. Freud popularized the idea that much of our mental life is hidden from our sort of everyday awareness, and the idea that Freudian slips and dreams reveal unconscious material. This was all Freud. Modern neuroscience validates the idea that unconscious processing is a thing that happens, and they don't use Freud's sort of symbolic lens that he had at the time, but we certainly know that unconscious processing exists and it's real. And this idea still shapes our culture, right? Like, people still talk about the idea of, someone has these unconscious motives, or that a slip of the tongue sort of reveals their true intent, right? This was all Freud and his ideas, and they quickly got popularized and sort of embedded in our society. And I think we forget that some of these things come from Freud, right? He popularized these ideas, and maybe we take for granted the idea that we all have part of our brains that are unconscious and that drive our motivations in some way. Freud came up with all of this, and this was his idea. Next, the idea that childhood shapes adulthood. Freud argued that early experiences leave these lasting psychological imprints on us. And he was really the first person in the field of psychology to take children's inner lives seriously. While he came up with this whole model of psychosexual stages, and this is very outdated today, modern developmental and attachment research echoes his core insight that our childhood shapes our adulthood. And the same thing for trauma research today, right? Like, this still continues his legacy and his impact, or his emphasis on the impact of childhood experiences. Another idea that Freud had that's worth discussion is talking as treatment. Freud pioneered the idea of a talking cure, right? Talking has some positive impact. So rather than only medical interventions, the idea that words, stories, and reflection could be healing to someone, that was all Freud. Free association, or, this idea that you come into a therapy session and you just sort of say whatever's coming to the top of your mind at the moment, this gave patients agency to explore their minds. And this idea that talking is a form of treatment, this is the foundation for every talk therapy that followed. Cognitive behavioral therapy, person-centered therapy, all the branches of cognitive behavioral therapy, right? This is all founded on the idea that talking as a treatment is effective. And this was Freud's idea initially. He also had the idea of defense mechanisms. So Freud introduced the idea of repression, and he sort of hinted that there's others exist. And his daughter, Anna Freud, sort of expanded the list. So things like projection, denial, displacement, rationalization, all of these as defense mechanisms, right? These remain a part of our clinical language today, even if we're not doing Freudian psychoanalysis. And this is useful for both therapists and everyday people to sort of understand how humans cope with different conflicts, right? We have defense mechanisms. Our brain does these things in response to negative situations. All of this was Freud, and at least, Freud's daughter expanding on his ideas. Also, his model of the psyche, of the id, the ego, and the superego. This is dated, but it still has an impact on our culture and how we think about things today. So he had this structural model that offered a map of human drives, regulation, morality. He had the idea that all of us have an id, is what he called it, which is sort of our instincts and our desires, our natural drives. We all have a superego, which is a conscience that has sort of these internalized rules from society. And we have our ego, which mediates between the two and deals with the reality of life. And again, we wouldn't have this idea if it wasn't for Freud. And we sort of take this for granted today, the fact that this is sort of absorbed into our culture. We've got this id, we've got the superego, and the ego mediates between them. This model is oversimplified, obviously, but it framed human behavior as conflict between these impulses, reality, and values. And, like I said with our culture, this still influences how our culture talks about morality and desire today. Also, we all know that Freud had a significant emphasis on sex with his model and how he thought about things. At the time, Freud sort of shocked his Victorian society by openly talking about sexuality. He had an overemphasis on sex, and this has been mocked, but his boldness opened the dialogue for talking about these taboo topics. He recognized libido as a powerful motivator when society pretended like it wasn't, and today we can see his sexual theories as too narrow, but his courage to confront repression was significant. Today we talk a lot about being sex positive, openly talking about sex in the context that we need to, and Freud definitely pioneered this. He lived in a time where it was considered inappropriate to discuss these things, and he had no problem discussing them. Again, he had theories about sex that were incorrect, but at least he sort of had the courage to talk about them when his society didn't have the courage to talk about them. Now we'll conclude the video by talking about why we dismiss Freud today. Freud had many theories that lack empirical support. His idea of the Oedipus complex, of dream symbolism, of penis envy, right? We can all look back on these and see them as silly, bizarre ideas, and that's totally fair. Also, his methods relied on case studies, not controlled experiments, and that's significant to point out. Freud had cultural biases that were patriarchal, heteronormative, Eurocentric, and we should point these out as well. Also, his psychoanalysis became this rigid dogma for decades after he introduced it, and this limited scientific progress for a significant period of time. Today, Freud's main value is historical. He opened the door to psychotherapy. Even if others had to walk through that door and sort of correct his course, we should recognize the fact that he did open that door. Like, we may not have psychotherapy today if it wasn't for Freud. And that's sort of the take-home of this video, if nothing else. Like, he introduced psychotherapy, and we can't forget that. I know this video is much shorter than much of my prior videos. I just wanted to spend some time talking about Freud. That's about all I had today. If you have any thoughts, any questions, feel free to drop them down in the comments section below. But that's all I've got. You have a good rest of your day. Take care.